You already know the story of the Library of Alexandria, or you think you do. Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever assembled was destroyed in a fire. Maybe it was Julius Caesar's troops during the siege. Maybe it was a Christian mob tearing down a pagan temple. Maybe it was the Arab conquest 6 centuries later. The details shift depending on who is telling the story, but the shape of it never changes. There was a library. It was magnificent. It burned, and humanity lost something that can never be recovered. That is the version you were taught. And it is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not oversimplified in the way that textbooks always smooth the edges of history. It is wrong in a way that obscures the actual cause of death so completely that the real lesson of Alexandria has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years and almost nobody has absorbed it. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed by fire. It was destroyed by budget cuts, by the withdrawal of government funding, by the political purging of scholars, by the deliberate replacement of the institution's leadership with military appointees who had no scholarly qualifications whatsoever. The scrolls did not burn. They rotted slowly, over centuries, because nobody was being paid to recopy them anymore, because the government that had built the greatest research institution in the ancient world decided, through a long sequence of ordinary administrative decisions spread across 400 years, that maintaining it was no longer worth the expense. And the reason this version of the story should unsettle you is not what it reveals about the ancient world. It is what it reveals about right now. Because the numbers I'm going to give you later are not metaphors. They are not loose historical parallels you have to squint at to see the resemblance. They are the same mechanism, operating on the same type of institutions, producing the same type of damage, measured in the same units, and almost nobody is framing it as what it actually is. I spent an unreasonable amount of time with the primary sources on this, the actual ancient texts, the archaeology, the work of Roger Bagnall at NYU and Mostafa El-Abbadi at the University of Alexandria, and Diana Delia and P.M. Fraser. What I found is a pattern so precise that at a certain point it stopped feeling like historical research and started feeling like reading tomorrow's headlines. But this story does not start with a destruction. It starts with something most people never bother to think about, which is what the Library of Alexandria actually was. Because it was not a library, not in any sense you would recognize. It was a state-funded research institute called the Mousion, the Shrine of the Muses, which is the root of our word museum, and it was embedded directly within the royal palace complex of Alexandria, in a district called the Bruchion, right next to the harbor. The Greek geographer Strabo visited around 20 BCE and left us a physical description. He described a peripatos, a colonnaded walkway built for philosophical discussion, an exedra, a columned hall with rows of seating for lectures and debate, a large oikos, a communal dining room where the scholars ate together every day, shared housing, shared property, a community of researchers governed by a priest who was, in Strabo's words, formerly appointed by the kings but now by Caesar. Think about that structure for a moment. Over 100 scholars lived there full-time at the institution's peak, and every single one of them was funded entirely by the Egyptian crown. Free housing, free meals, free servants, complete exemption from all taxes. The writer Athenaeus described them as being fed like the choicest birds in a coop. And I keep returning to that image because it contains the entire tragedy of what happened later. A bird in a coop is completely dependent on the hand that fills the feeder. The coop does not have a backup plan. There is no emergency fund. There is no diversified revenue stream. There is a hand and there is a feeder, and when the hand stops coming, the bird starves. The Mousion had no endowment, no tuition income, no independent funding base of any kind. It had a dynasty of kings who believed that knowledge was worth paying for. And the vulnerability that nobody seemed to worry about was simply this: what happens when a king stops believing that? The early Ptolemies did not just believe it, they were consumed by it. The funding came from Egypt's extraordinary natural wealth. The Ptolemaic dynasty held monopolies on two of the ancient world's most critical commodities: grain, because Egypt was the breadbasket of the entire Mediterranean, the single most important source of food for hundreds of millions of people across the ancient world. And papyrus, because Egypt was effectively the sole significant producer of the world's primary writing material. Everything written in the ancient Mediterranean was written on Egyptian papyrus. That double monopoly generated wealth on a scale that no other Hellenistic kingdom could match. And the early Ptolemies deployed it with a ferocity that went well beyond generous patronage into something closer to state-sponsored obsession. Ptolemy II, who reigned from 283 to 246 BCE, set an official target of 500,000 scrolls. He funded an acquisitions program so aggressive it functioned as legalized piracy. Every ship that entered the harbor at Alexandria was boarded by customs officials. Any books found on board, regardless of who owned them, were confiscated. Royal scribes made copies, returned the copies to the original owners, and the library kept the originals. Books acquired this way were catalogued under a specific notation from the ships. Think about what that means. If you were a merchant sailing into Alexandria with a copy of a rare philosophical text tucked among your personal belongings, the government would take your book, hand you back a copy, and file the original in the royal collection. And there was nothing you could do about it. His successor, Ptolemy III, pushed the program even further. He borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the complete plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were not ordinary copies. They were the canonical texts, the authoritative master versions that Athens used to verify every other copy in circulation. Ptolemy left 15 talents of silver as a security deposit. To give you a sense of what that sum meant, 15 talents could fund a warship for a year. It was an enormous amount of money, and it was meant to demonstrate good faith. Then he kept the originals, sent Athens back copies, and cheerfully forfeited the deposit. The originals were worth more to him than the money. The historian Lionel Casson put it plainly: Egypt was far richer than the lands of their rivals. The Ptolemies, able to outspend the others, took the lead. And the institution they built with that money produced results that justified every coin of the investment. The achievements that came out of the funded Mousion are extraordinary, and I need to walk through several of them in detail, because the specifics are going to matter enormously later when we talk about what was lost and how long it took to recover. Eratosthenes of Cyrene arrived at the library around 245 BCE. He had studied at Plato's Academy in Athens under the philosopher Arcesilaus, before Ptolemy III personally invited him to Alexandria to serve as chief librarian and tutor to the royal children. He became the third head librarian, and his nickname among colleagues was Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he was considered second best at everything. which was itself a kind of backhanded tribute to his extraordinary range, because the things Eratosthenes accomplished were among the most significant in the history of human thought. While reading through the library's manuscript collection, Eratosthenes came across a detail that changed the course of geography forever. He read that in the city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, in southern Egypt, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a deep well and cast no shadow at all. The sun was perfectly overhead. He knew that in Alexandria, 500 miles to the north, on the same day at the same time, a vertical stick cast a measurable shadow. The sun was not directly overhead, it was offset by an angle. He measured that angle at 7.2 degrees, and then he did something that no one had ever done before. He reasoned that if the Earth is a sphere, and if the sun's rays arrive at the surface effectively parallel, which they do because the sun is so far away, then the angle of the shadow at Alexandria gives you the fraction of the Earth's circumference between the two cities. 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of a full 360-degree circle. So the distance between Alexandria and Syene must be 1/50th of the total distance around the planet. He hired matists, professional surveyors trained by the Egyptian military to walk with precisely calibrated equal steps over enormous distances. And they measured the distance between the two cities at 5,000 stadia. The calculation was simple and beautiful. 5,000 stadia times 50 equals 250,000 stadia. Converting to modern units, that yields approximately 40,338 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth, as measured by modern satellite geodesy, is 40,075 kilometers. He was accurate to within 2%. In the 3rd century BCE, using nothing but shadows, basic geometry, and the resources of a funded library. His original work, describing the full methodology, a text called On the Measure of the Earth, is lost. We know how he did it only because a later writer named Cleomedes summarized the method. The original proof was never recopied. It disintegrated along with everything else. And here is the cost of that specific loss, measured not in cultural value, but in hard consequences. The astronomer Ptolemy, working centuries later, rejected Eratosthenes' correct circumference and instead adopted the smaller, incorrect estimate from the astronomer Posidonius. That wrong number became the standard reference for over 1,000 years because it was the one that got recopied into the texts that survived. Columbus used the wrong number when he calculated that a westward ocean crossing from Europe to Asia was feasible. He believed the Earth was smaller than it actually is. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean because a correct measurement made inside a funded library was lost when the library was defunded and an incorrect measurement survived in its place. That is what it costs when you stop funding the scribes. Not an abstract cultural loss, a navigational error that redirected the course of world history. Eratosthenes went blind in old age. He starved himself to death around 194 BCE. He also invented the sieve of Eratosthenes for finding prime numbers, a method still used in computer science today. He coined the term geography. He created the first map of the known world using lines of latitude and longitude. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis. Every one of those contributions was made possible by the institutional support of the Mousion, and the original texts describing most of them are gone. Working in the same ecosystem, funded by the same institution, Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the sun, not the earth, sits at the center of the cosmos. This was around 280 BCE, approximately 1800 years before Copernicus. His model held that the earth revolves around the sun once a year, rotates on its own axis once a day, and that the fixed stars are immensely far away, so far that the motion of the earth through space produces no detectable change in their apparent positions. Archimedes described the theory in the Sand Reckoner. The Stoic philosopher Cleanthes reportedly said that Aristarchus should be tried for impiety for disturbing the foundation of the cosmos. Most ancient astronomers rejected the theory, not because it was disproven, but because the geocentric model, with its system of epicycles, actually generated better predictions of planetary motion, and because the stellar parallax that Aristarchus's model predicted, the tiny apparent shift in star positions as the Earth orbits, was far too small for ancient instruments to detect. The theory was correct, but could not be confirmed with the technology of the time. Aristarchus's writings on the heliocentric system are entirely lost. His only surviving work, on the sizes and distances of the sun and moon, ironically uses the geocentric model. When Copernicus independently arrived at the same conclusion 1800 years later, he cited Aristarchus in an early manuscript of De Revolutionibus. Then he deleted the reference before publication. The man who was right about the architecture of the solar system had his proof dissolved by institutional neglect, and when the proof was finally rebuilt from scratch, the man who rebuilt it erased the credit. I am telling you all of this not as background color. Every single one of these achievements was produced by a funded institution, and every single one of the original works describing them was destroyed when that funding was withdrawn. The library did not just store old scrolls, it generated new knowledge at the frontier of human understanding. And when it was defunded, the generation stopped and the storage failed simultaneously. The thing that killed it was not fire, it was a Ptolemy. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII seized the Egyptian throne after his brother Ptolemy VI died on a military campaign. His nickname was Physcon, pot belly. The Alexandrians also called him Cacergetes, the malefactor, a vicious pun on his official title, Euergetes, which means benefactor. He was, by every ancient account, a spectacularly cruel ruler. He murdered his nephew, Ptolemy VII, during the wedding feast. He married his brother's widow, Cleopatra II, and then also married her daughter, his own niece, Cleopatra III. His personal savagery was legendary, but it was his political calculation that destroyed the library. He viewed the intellectual class of Alexandria as a political threat. They had supported a rival faction, and so, in 145 BCE, he launched a systematic purge. The historian Justin reports that he unleashed his soldiers on the streets of the city, with orders to kill indiscriminately. They murdered until Ptolemy was left, in Justin's words, alone with his soldiers, in so large a city, a king not of men, but of empty houses. Valerius Maximus records that young men who tried to take refuge in the gymnasium were burned alive inside it. Then came the intellectual purge, not a selective removal of specific dissidents, a wholesale expulsion of the entire educated class. The writer Athenaeus preserved the scope. Philologians, philosophers, mathematicians, musicians, painters, athletic trainers, physicians, and many other men of skill in their profession. Every one of them expelled from the city. Rudolf Pfeiffer, the great German classicist, called it the first crisis in the history of scholarship. The casualties included Aristarchus of Samothrace, the sixth head librarian and the most accomplished textual critic in the ancient world. He had been Ptolemy VIII's own childhood tutor. The personal relationship counted for nothing. He fled to Cyprus and died soon after, in circumstances that the sources do not describe, but that were clearly connected to the trauma of exile. Apollodorus of Athens went to Pergamum, Alexandria's chief intellectual competitor. Dionysius Thrax, one of Aristarchus's most gifted students, established a school on the island of Rhodes, and there wrote the first systematic grammar of the Greek language. The Techni Grammatique, a textbook that remained the standard reference for over 1,000 years. The knowledge that Alexandria had spent a century gathering was scattered across the Mediterranean by political violence in a single year. And then Ptolemy VIII made the decision that I think is the most revealing moment in this entire story. He needed to appoint a new head librarian. He chose Sidas, one of his palace guards, a military man with zero scholarly credentials of any kind. This was not carelessness. It was a statement of priorities. The position of head librarian had been one of the most prestigious intellectual appointments in the ancient world. Zenodotus, Callimachus, Eratosthenes, Aristophanes of Byzantium, Aristarchus of Samothrace. These were not just librarians. They were among the most important scholars of their age. After Sidas, the position degraded so completely that contemporary writers stopped bothering to record who held it. Later, Ptolemies used it as a patronage slot, a reward for political loyalty rather than scholarly achievement. There is a bitter irony here that I do not want to skip past. Ptolemy VIII was himself a scholar. He wrote a study of Homer. He authored 24 books of historical commentaries called the Hypomnemata. This was not a man who failed to understand the value of knowledge. He understood it perfectly. He just understood political power better. And when the two came into conflict, the knowledge lost. A second purge followed in 126 BCE when Ptolemy reconquered Alexandria from Cleopatra II. More scholars fled, more institutional memory evaporated. The library's long death had begun, and it would take the form not of a single catastrophe, but of a slow, century-spanning withdrawal of the conditions that had made the institution possible. Now, the 4 fires. I need to dismantle these one at a time, because they are not just historically inaccurate. They are actively concealing the real cause of death. They provide a dramatic, cinematic narrative that satisfies the human need for a single decisive moment of destruction. And in doing so, they make the actual mechanism of institutional death, which is gradual, administrative, and boring, completely invisible. Caesar's fire, 48 BCE. During the civil war against Pompey, Caesar found himself besieged in Alexandria and ordered ships burned in the harbor. The fire spread into the city. That much is documented. But Caesar himself, in his account of the siege, the De Bello Civili, says absolutely nothing about the library. His officer Hirtius noted specifically that Alexandria was almost completely secure against fire because its buildings contain no carpentry or timber. The first mention of book losses comes from Seneca, writing roughly a century later. 40,000 books burned at Alexandria, but Seneca does not specify which collection. and the word he uses for the location is ambiguous. The most important counter-evidence is twofold. First, the geographer Strabo visited the Mousion decades after Caesar's fire and described it as a functioning institution. Whatever burned was not the main library. Second, the classicist Diana Delia made an observation I find devastating. She pointed out the silence of Cicero. Cicero was alive during this period. He was, in her words, an omnivorous bibliophile and gossip who commented on everything. If Caesar had destroyed the greatest library in the world, Cicero would have written about it compulsively. He never mentioned it. His silence is not a gap in the record. It is evidence that the event, as popularly described, did not happen. Aurelian's destruction of the Bruttium, 272 CE, Roman forces retaking Alexandria from Palmyrene rebels destroyed the entire royal quarter where the Mousion had been located. By the time the writer Epiphanius visited the area a century later, it was a wasteland that had been excluded from the city walls. If any physical remnant of the library survived to this point, Aurelian's troops destroyed it. But the institution had been in terminal decline for over a century. The scholars were gone. The funding was gone. Aurelian demolished the ruins of a library that had already died of neglect. He destroyed a building, not a living institution. Theophilus and the Serapeum, 391 CE, following Emperor Theodosius's decree prohibiting pagan worship, Bishop Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis that housed a smaller satellite collection known as the Daughter Library. A church was built on the site. This is documented destruction of a structure that once held books. But it was the Daughter Library, not the Royal Library, and 5 contemporary accounts of the demolition do not mention books being destroyed. It is genuinely unclear whether the Serapeum still contained any significant collection by 391. The Arab conquest of 642. The story that Caliph Umar ordered the remaining scrolls used as fuel for the city's bathhouses, reportedly saying that books agreeing with the Quran were superfluous and books contradicting it were heretical, first appears in accounts written more than 500 years after the supposed event. The man allegedly present for the conversation, John Philoponus, was almost certainly dead before the conquest occurred. The historian Bernard Lewis argued persuasively that the story was fabricated during the Ayyubid period to justify Saladin's dispersal of Shiite libraries. Mostafa El-Abbadi, the foremost modern authority on the library's history, demolished the narrative through careful textual analysis of the original Arabic sources. It is a fabrication created to serve a later political purpose. 4 fires, 4 myths, and behind all of them, the actual mechanism of death sitting in the open, unexamined, because a budget cut is not dramatic enough for the version of history that human beings prefer to tell. The real killing blow came in 215 CE. Emperor Caracalla visited Alexandria, and after the citizens publicly mocked him, unleashed a massacre. But the violence was not the lasting damage. The lasting damage was administrative. He suspended the revenues of the Mousion. He abolished members' stipends. He expelled all foreign scholars. The historian Heather Phillips summarized it in a single sentence. When the emperor abolished their stipends and forbade foreign scholars from coming to the library, he effectively shut down operations. Membership in the Mousion appears to have ceased entirely by the 260 CE. No fire, no mob, no dramatic confrontation. A budget line deleted from an imperial ledger, and the institution that had produced some of the most important discoveries in the history of human thought simply stopped existing. Nobody recorded the date the last scholar walked out. Nobody wrote down the year the last scroll was recopied. Because institutional death by defunding does not produce a moment. It produces a silence, and silence does not make the history books. And the silence swallowed almost everything. Here is what it costs when knowledge infrastructure collapses. Not the sentimental version, the specific, quantified, documented version. Only 1 to 5% of all ancient Greek literature survives. Not 1 to 5% of popular literature. Not 1 to 5% of the lightweight stuff that nobody cared about. 1 to 5% of everything. The complete Loeb Classical Library, which is the standard modern edition of the full surviving corpus of classical Greek and Latin literature, fills just 337 volumes for Greek. That is the entirety of what made it through. Every play, every philosophy, every history, every scientific treatise, every poem from a civilization that lasted over 1,000 years and produced, by any reasonable estimate, hundreds of thousands of individual works, 330 to 7 volumes. Start with the dramatists. Aeschylus wrote approximately 90 plays. He won first prize at the Athenian dramatic festivals 13 times. He is considered the father of tragedy. 7 of his plays survive. That is a survival rate of roughly 8%. Sophocles wrote approximately 120 plays. He won first prize at least 18 times and never placed lower than second in any competition he entered. 7 survive, 6%. Euripides wrote around 92 plays. He won the first prize only 4 or 5 times during his lifetime, but became by far the most popular of the 3 after his death, which is probably why more of his work was preserved. 18 or 19 survive. About 20%. Those 3 are the lucky ones. Astydamas, the most celebrated dramatist of the 4th century BCE, winner of the top prize at the dramatic festivals 15 times across a career that produced 240 tragedies, is survived by exactly 0 complete plays. Not 1. His name survives. His reputation survives. His work is gone. Sappho composed 10,000 lines of poetry, collected into 9 books, and was considered by the ancients to be one of the finest lyric poets who ever lived. Plato called her the 10th muse. Roughly 650 fragmentary lines remain. Most of those fragments are single words or partial sentences, recovered from papyrus scraps found in Egyptian garbage dumps. We know enough about her poetry to know what we lost. We do not have enough to experience it. Callimachus of Cyrene, who served at the library and may or may not have been head librarian depending on which source you trust, created the Pinakes. The full title was Tables of Persons Eminent in Every Branch of Learning, together with a list of their writings. It filled 120 scrolls, 5 times the length of Homer's Iliad. It was the first comprehensive bibliographic catalogue of all Greek literature, organized by genre, with each entry containing the author's name, birthplace, biographical details, a complete list of their works, the opening line of each work, and its total word count. Scholars consider it the origin of bibliography itself, the intellectual ancestor of every library catalogue and every database index ever created. The 10th century Arabic bibliographer Ibn al-Nadim modeled his own Al-Firist on it. It survives in 8 fragments, the catalogue of everything, gone. The index survived in scraps, while the collection it indexed disintegrated entirely. And the losses go well beyond literature and philosophy. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, built a device called the aeolipile, a hollow sphere mounted on an axle with 2 bent nozzles. When water inside the sphere was heated to steam, the jets of vapor spun the sphere on its axis. It was a working demonstration of steam-powered rotary motion. 17 centuries before James Watt. The device was described in Hero's Pneumatica, which survived through later copies, but the broader engineering tradition that might have developed it into a practical power source did not survive the collapse of the institutional infrastructure that supported it. We do not know what Hero might have built next, or what his students might have built after that, because the pipeline was broken. And then there is Aristotle, and this is the case I keep returning to because it captures the specific cruelty of what institutional neglect does to knowledge with a precision that I find almost unbearable. Diogenes Laertius catalogued approximately 156 titles, by Aristotle comprising roughly 400 individual books. About 31 treatises survive. If that were the whole story, it would be bad enough. A survival rate of roughly 1 in 5, 1 in 12, depending on how you count. But the deeper damage, the part that makes classicists wince, is that we possess the wrong Aristotle. Aristotle wrote 2 kinds of works. The Exoterica were his published writings, literary dialogues meant for a public audience, polished and elegant. The Esoterica were his internal lecture notes, rough working documents used within his school, the Lyceum, never intended for publication. What survived is overwhelmingly the Esoterica, the rough drafts, the lecture notes, the internal working documents that Aristotle himself would probably have been embarrassed to see published. His actual published works, the ones that Cicero praised as a river of gold compared to Plato's river of silver, are almost entirely gone. We know they were brilliant because every ancient writer who mentions them says so. We cannot read them because they were not recopied. And then there is this detail. Aristotle composed 158 studies of the constitutions of different Greek city-states, 158 individual constitutions, analyzed and compared. A comparative political science project that was unmatched in the ancient world and would not be attempted again at that scale for millennia. Of those 158, exactly 1 survives, the Constitution of Athens, and it was not recovered through the scholarly transmission chain. It was found on a papyrus in an Egyptian garbage dump in 1879. We have been studying Aristotle's working drafts for 2,000 years and calling them his masterwork because the masterwork was never recopied after the people whose job it was to recopy things stopped being paid. And the knowledge delays that resulted from these losses are measurable in units that should make your stomach drop. Aristarchus of Samos proposed the heliocentric model around 280 BCE. Copernicus published De Revolutionibus in 1543 CE. That is approximately 1800 years. 1800 years of geocentrism that did not need to happen, because the correct answer already existed and was lost when the institution that housed it was defunded. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam-powered device, the aeolipile, in the 1st century CE. The Industrial Revolution, which was fundamentally built on the harnessing of steam power, began in the 18th century. That is roughly 1700 years. The Antikythera mechanism, a mechanical analog computer, recovered from a Greek shipwreck and dated to approximately 100 BCE, is so sophisticated that mechanical devices of comparable complexity do not reappear in the historical record for over 1,500 years. These numbers are not trivia for classicists. They are not abstract measurements of cultural loss. They are centuries. Each one of those centuries contained millions of human beings who lived and died in conditions that did not need to be as difficult, as short, as brutal as they were, because the knowledge that could have improved those conditions already existed, had already been discovered, had already been written down, and was allowed to disappear because the people maintaining the infrastructure that housed it were no longer being funded. And it is not only about the famous names and the headline discoveries. The Mousion produced something less visible, but arguably more valuable than any individual breakthrough. It produced a continuous tradition of trained researchers who could build on each other's work across generations. When Eratosthenes measured the Earth, he was building on the astronomical observations of scholars who had worked at the library before him. When Aristarchus proposed heliocentrism, he was working within a mathematical tradition that the Mousion had cultivated for decades. When Callimachus created the Pinakes, he was systematizing the collective output of hundreds of thinkers. The institution was not just a warehouse, it was a pipeline, a lineage of training, method, and accumulated insight that took generations to build and could not be reassembled once broken. When Ptolemy VIII expelled the scholars, he did not just scatter individuals. He severed the pipeline. The knowledge that those individuals carried in their heads could be reconstructed slowly, over time, in other places. But the institutional culture, the system of mentorship and collaboration, and accumulated methodological refinement, that was gone, and it did not come back, not for a very long time. The papyrologist Roger Bagnall published a paper in 2002 that I think contains the single most important sentence ever written about the Library of Alexandria. The paper was called Alexandria, Library of Dreams. And Bagnall, who was trained to be skeptical of romantic narratives about papyrus, approached the library's history with forensic precision. He identified what he called a whole literature of wishful thinking and produced an analysis that stripped away centuries of mythology. And his conclusion was this: it is not that the disappearance of a library led to a dark age, nor that its survival would have improved those ages. Rather, the dark ages, if that is what they were, led to the disappearance of the library. The neglect came first. The defunding came first. The institutional decay came first. The decision that knowledge was not worth maintaining came first, and then the library disappeared, not the other way around. And the 1 to 5% that did survive barely made it. The transmission chains that carried ancient knowledge to the modern world were absurdly fragile, and understanding how thin those threads were makes the modern parallel even more disturbing. Greek knowledge survived through 3 routes, each one of which could easily have failed entirely. The first was the Byzantine Empire, which maintained continuous Greek language scholarship for 1,000 years after Rome fell. When Constantinople was sacked by the Ottomans in 1453, Greek scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts, and their arrival in Italy helped ignite the Renaissance. If Constantinople had fallen a century earlier, before the printing press existed in Europe, much of what those scholars carried might have been lost a second time. The second route was the Islamic Golden Age. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo translated Greek scientific and philosophical works into Arabic, preserving texts that had vanished from the Latin-speaking West. Those Arabic translations reached Europe through contact points in Toledo, Palermo, and Sicily during the 12th and 13th centuries. where they were translated back into Latin. Aristotle's natural philosophy, Ptolemy's astronomy, Euclid's geometry, Galen's medicine, all of them returned to Europe through Arabic intermediaries centuries after the Greek originals had crumbled. If the Abbasid translation movement had not happened, if the caliphs had not funded their own version of the Mousion, vast portions of Greek science would have vanished permanently. The third route was the Carolingian monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries, where monks copied Latin texts with painstaking care. Nearly 90% of surviving works of ancient Rome exist in their earliest form in Carolingian manuscripts from around 800 CE. A handful of monasteries, copying by candlelight, preserved the intellectual output of an entire civilization. And there are still discoveries being made from the wreckage. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, roughly 500,000 scraps recovered from an ancient garbage dump in Egypt, have yielded fragments of Homer, Plato, Euclid, and previously unknown plays. The Herculaneum scrolls, approximately 600 papyrus rolls, carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, are now being read for the first time using artificial intelligence and particle accelerator imaging. The villa that housed them has been only partially excavated. There may be thousands more scrolls underground. Some of them may contain texts copied from the Library of Alexandria. We do not know yet. But the fact that we are using 21st century technology to read documents that have been unreadable for 2,000 years tells you something about the stakes of preservation. Knowledge that is lost is not always lost forever, but the gap between loss and recovery can be measured in millennia. And during those millennia, people suffer unnecessarily because the answers to their problems are sitting in the ground, unreadable, waiting for someone to invent the technology to recover them. I need you to hold Bagnall's sentence in your mind, because now I am going to give you the modern numbers. Federal research and development spending in the United States peaked at 1.86% of GDP in 1964, at the height of the space race. By 2024, it had fallen to 0.63%. That is not a fluctuation. That is a 6-decade structural retreat from the knowledge enterprise. The federal share of total national R&D dropped from roughly 60% in the 1960s to approximately 18% in 2022. In 1964, the United States government invested $2 in research and development for every $1 from the private sector. By $22, that ratio had inverted. The government invested 24 cents for every private dollar. The hand that filled the feeder did not stop all at once. It pulled back gradually, over decades, until the feeder was nearly empty. The National Institutes of Health budget doubled between 1998 and 2003, from roughly $13.6 billion to $27.1 billion. It was a deliberate, bipartisan investment in biomedical research. And then it stopped, not with a cut, with a freeze. A study published in JAMA in 2005 confirmed that in inflation-adjusted terms, NIH purchasing power in 2004 stood 7.4% below its 2003 peak. 21 years of real erosion. And during those 21 years, the cost of doing science, the price of reagents, the price of sequencing, the price of specialized equipment went up every single year. The result was predictable. Grant success rates collapsed from above 30% during the doubling era to approximately 20 to 21%. By 2024, 4 out of every 5 grant applications rejected Not because the science was inadequate, because the money was not there. And then 2025 arrived, and the erosion accelerated into something that felt less like institutional decline and more like demolition. Over 7,800 grants were cancelled or suspended at NIH and NSF in a single year. Billions of dollars in research funding frozen. At least 160 clinical trials were halted midway through, with patients enrolled with data half collected, with years of work suddenly orphaned. More than 25,000 workers left federal science agencies. A survey published in Nature found that 75% of American scientists had considered leaving the country, not as a rhetorical gesture, as a practical career decision, because the infrastructure that supported their work was being dismantled. Congress ultimately blocked the most extreme proposed cuts, but the fiscal year 2207 budget proposal, released in April of 2006, came back a 12% cut to NIH. The proposed elimination of 3 of its 27 institutes, a 54.5% reduction to the National Science Foundation. The pattern was not a one-time event. It was a ratchet. I want to make sure this connects. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII expelled every intellectual from Alexandria and replaced the head librarian with a palace guard. In 2205, 75% of American scientists considered leaving the country, and over 7,800 research grants were terminated. The mechanism is identical. A political authority decides that the people generating knowledge are expendable, and the people generating knowledge begin to leave. Ptolemy did it by royal decree in a single year. The modern version does it through annual budget proposals and grant review cycles, which accomplishes the same result but generates no headlines because there is no single dramatic moment. Not a fire, not a purge decree, just a spreadsheet. And the knowledge that does get produced is increasingly locked away behind private paywalls. The academic publishing industry generates roughly $19 to $25 billion annually. The top 5 publishers control about half of all published research and operate at profit margins that rival technology companies. Elsevier runs its journals division at roughly 40% margins, built on a model where researchers do all of the intellectual labor, writing, peer review, editing, without payment from the publisher. And then the publisher charges everyone else $30 to $50 per article to read the results. Harvard called its annual $3.5 million subscription bill fiscally unsustainable. The University of California walked away from an $11 million per year Elsevier contract in 2019 over pricing. Sci-Hub, a pirate site built and maintained by a single 22-year-old graduate student from Kazakhstan named Alexandra El-Bakyan, now hosts 80 to 5% of all paywalled journal articles and has served over 1 billion downloads worldwide. That a piracy operation run by one person provides better access to publicly funded science than the governments that funded it is not an ironic footnote. It is a structural indictment. In the United Kingdom, approximately 800 public libraries have closed since austerity measures began in 2010. Roughly 1/5 of the national total gone in 15 years. Library spending was cut by nearly 48%. Paid professional staff were halved from 24,000 to fewer than 10,000. Their positions filled by over 51,000 unpaid volunteers. Think about what that means in practice. A trained librarian with a graduate degree in information science. Someone whose professional purpose is the organization and preservation and transmission of knowledge, was replaced by a retiree donating a few hours a week. The institutional competence was not maintained. It was hollowed out and replaced with goodwill, which is admirable, but is not the same thing. In Northern Ireland, public libraries could not afford to purchase a single new book during the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year. Not one. An entire region's library system, frozen in time, acquiring no new knowledge because the budget was gone. In the United States, the assault on knowledge infrastructure has taken a different but equally systematic form. PEN America documented over 22,800 instances of book bans across 45 states since 2021. In the 2023 to 2004 school year alone, over 10,000 banning instances occurred, affecting more than 4,000 unique titles. Before 2020, the national baseline for book challenges was roughly 273 unique titles per year. That is a 9-fold increase in 4 years. And the character of the banning has changed. In 2004, 72% of censorship actions were initiated not by individual parents concerned about a specific book their child brought home, but by organized political pressure groups and government entities working from standardized lists of targeted titles. This is not spontaneous community concern. This is coordinated removal of knowledge from public institutions. The mechanism is different from Ptolemy's purge. The effect is the same. Humanities, bachelor's degrees in the United States fell from nearly 1 in 5 in the late 1960s to fewer than 1 in 10 by 2020. The lowest share ever recorded in American higher education. The pipeline that produces people trained in critical reading, historical analysis, philosophical reasoning, and cultural interpretation. The pipeline that produces people capable of recognizing patterns, like the one I have been describing for the past hour, is being systematically narrowed. West Virginia University, in 2003, eliminated 12 graduate programs, 28 majors, and 143 faculty positions, becoming the first American flagship state university to make structural academic cuts of that scale. The University of Chicago paused PhD admissions in nearly all humanities and social sciences in 2005. Japan in 2015 urged its universities to close their humanities departments. More than 50 complied. In April 2005, DOGE terminated over 1,200 National Endowment for the Humanities grants, spanning all 50 states, and fired 65% of the NEH workforce in a single action. And the economic cost of failing to maintain knowledge infrastructure is not speculative. It has been measured. Every dollar invested in NIH research returns $2.56 in economic activity. The Human Genome Project produced a return of $4.75 per dollar, and now supports more than 850,000 jobs. A joint study by Harvard and Novartis found that 8 of every 10 transformative medicines trace back to basic research discoveries that had no clear drug pathway when they were made, with an average timeline of 30 years from initial discovery to approved treatment. That 30-year gap is everything. It means the grants being terminated right now will not show their consequences for a generation. The researcher who loses funding in 2025 was working on something that might have mattered enormously in 2055. But the work will not be done. The lab will close. The team will disperse. The doctoral students will leave the field. I want to make this concrete because abstractions are how this kind of damage stays invisible. Maria Sweetwine is a researcher at the University of Washington who studies mitochondrial dysfunction in aging kidneys. Her NIH grant was rescinded in 2005. She expected to shut down her lab by 2026. Her doctoral students would need to find new advisors or leave the field entirely. The specific line of inquiry she was pursuing, a thread of investigation into why kidneys age the way they do and whether that process can be slowed, would simply stop. Not because the science was wrong, not because someone replicated her results and found an error, not because the question was answered, because the money was cut. She is Aristarchus of Samothrace in 2205, a working scholar at the productive peak of her career, driven from her work not by a tyrant's decree, but by an administrative decision made in a budget office by people who will never know her name. And like Aristarchus of Samothrace, who fled Alexandria and died on Cyprus in circumstances nobody thought to record in detail, Sweetwine's departure from the field will not make the history books. There will be no dramatic moment, no headline, just a lab going dark, just a line of inquiry that stops, just a silence where a question used to be. And this is happening thousands of times simultaneously. The doctoral pipeline in the biomedical sciences takes 10 to 15 years. You cannot rebuild a research team overnight. The graduate student who decides in 2025 that the funding climate is too unstable to commit a decade of her life to a research career is making a rational decision that will have consequences. Nobody can predict for decades, because we do not know what she would have discovered. We only know that she will not discover it now. The ancient knowledge delays tell us exactly how expensive these absences become. 1800 years between a correct model of the solar system and its recovery. 1700 years between a working steam device and its industrial application. 1500 years between an analog computer and clockwork of comparable complexity. Those centuries were not empty of effort. People were working, thinking, experimenting throughout them. But they were starting from scratch on problems that had already been solved because the solutions were not maintained. Every century in those gaps represents a civilization doing unnecessary work, rebuilding from the foundation what could have been built from the roof. And in 30 years, when the treatment does not exist, when the breakthrough does not arrive, when the technology is not ready, nobody will trace the absence back to a budget line quietly deleted in a fiscal year that nobody remembers. That is how knowledge dies. Not with a conflagration, with a memo, with a spreadsheet cell that someone decided to zero out. In March of 415 CE, a mob of Parabolani, volunteer militia monks, loyal to Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, intercepted the mathematician Hypatia on a street in Alexandria. They dragged her from her carriage, they stripped her, they killed her with ostraca, broken roof tiles scraped across skin until it came away from muscle. They tore her body apart and burned the pieces. She was approximately 65 years old. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, who was the last person definitively known to have been a member of the Mousion. She had been educated by her father and had surpassed him. She edited commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, the foundational text of what we now call algebra, and on Apollonius's Conics, the definitive ancient treatment of ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. She helped her father produce the edition of Euclid's Elements that became the standard mathematical text used across the Mediterranean for centuries. She taught her students who included the future Bishop Synesius of Cyrene, how to build astrolabes for astronomical measurement, and hydrometers for determining the density of liquids. Synesius's letters to her survive, and they are full of intellectual respect and personal affection. He called her the genuine, the revered philosopher. She was, by all accounts, the most prominent intellectual figure in Alexandria and one of the most respected thinkers in the late Roman world. Her murder was political. The prefect Orestes, who governed Alexandria on behalf of the Roman emperor, relied on Hypatia as an advisor. Bishop Cyril wanted Orestes out of the way. Hypatia was the connection between Orestes and the pagan intellectual tradition that Cyril viewed as a rival source of authority. The philosopher Damascius blamed Cyril directly, writing that the attack was motivated by envy over her wisdom exceeding all bounds. Whether Cyril personally ordered the murder or merely created the conditions in which his followers felt empowered to commit it has been debated for 16 centuries. What is not debated is the outcome. Cyril of Alexandria was later declared a doctor of the Church by Pope Leo XIII in 1882. A saint, Hypatia was not killed because of the library. By 415 CE, the library had been dead for well over a century, emptied out by decades of administrative neglect, its revenues suspended, its scholars expelled, its scrolls disintegrated in the coastal humidity because nobody was left whose job it was to recopy them. Hypatia was the last echo of an institution that had already been defunded out of existence. She was what remains when the budget is cut and the grants are terminated and the scholars disperse. A single person, working alone, trying to maintain a tradition of knowledge that an entire civilization had collectively decided was no longer worth the cost of preservation. They killed her for it, and then they made the man who ordered it a saint. And that detail is the one that stays with me long after the rest of the history fades. Not the violence, which was extreme but not unusual for late antiquity. The canonization, the institutional endorsement, because it means the people who destroyed the knowledge infrastructure of the ancient world did not experience themselves as destroyers. They were not conscious of committing a civilizational crime. They experienced themselves as governors, as administrators, as responsible stewards making rational decisions about the allocation of finite resources. They looked at the Mousion and saw a budget line. They looked at the scholars and saw political complications. They looked at the scrolls and saw old documents that nobody with any real power was reading anymore. Nobody in the 3rd century woke up one morning and said, "Today I am going to destroy the Library of Alexandria." They said, "Today I am going to cut this expenditure. Today I am going to reassign this position to someone more politically reliable. Today I am going to redirect these funds towards something more practical, more immediate, more useful." The destruction happened in a language of prudence, not vandalism. And that is precisely what made it invisible while it was happening. That is what made it possible for the man who ordered the murder of the last Alexandrian scholar to be canonized as a saint without anyone perceiving a contradiction. He was not destroying knowledge, he was governing. And 7,800 grants terminated, and 75% of scientists considering leaving, and 800 libraries closed, and 22,000 books banned, and humanities departments shuttered across 3 continents, and none of it producing the kind of collective response that a photograph of a burning building would produce. Because there is no burning building. There are only budget proposals, only spending bills, Only appropriations subcommittee markups in rooms that no one outside Washington has ever heard of. Only administrative decisions made by people who believe, with total sincerity, that they are governing responsibly. The scrolls are not burning. They are just not being recopied, and the people who would have recopied them are closing their labs, cancelling their lecture courses, declining to take new doctoral students because there is no funding to support them, and quietly, without ceremony, without a single headline, leaving. Not because a king expelled them by decree, because the feeder went empty. And the birds in the coop have learned, as birds in coops always eventually do, that they need to fly somewhere else or they will starve. Nobody is going to record the date it happened, because it is not a date, it is a budget cycle. It is a generation of unfunded proposals. It is a silence that will settle so gradually over so many years that by the time anyone thinks to measure the size of the gap, the people who could have told them what the scrolls contained will be gone. And the only evidence that anything was ever there will be the gap itself, the centuries-long gap between what we knew and what we will eventually, at great expense and after unnecessary suffering, have to rediscover from scratch. Eratosthenes measured the earth with shadows and a funded library. His measurement was lost when the funding stopped. The wrong number survived in its place, and a man sailed across an ocean because of the difference between a correct answer that was never recopied and an incorrect answer that was. Aristarchus figured out the architecture of the solar system 1800 years before Copernicus, and his proof evaporated because the scribes who would have recopied it were no longer employed. Hero built a working steam engine 1700 years before the Industrial Revolution, and nobody maintained the institutional infrastructure that would have transmitted the idea forward through the centuries. The math works the same way every time. The cost is always measured in centuries, and the centuries are always populated by people who did not need to suffer as long as they did. The only variable that has ever mattered, the only thing that has ever separated the world that preserves its knowledge from the world that loses it, is whether someone in a position of authority decides the scribes are still worth paying.